When Jesus heard that Herod had beheaded John the Baptist, he withdrew in a boat to a lonely place apart. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. As he went ashore, he saw a great throng, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a lonely place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They said to him, "We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and blessed, and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children.
Father, would you put your words upon my lips? Today we come to one of my favourite topics, which is the miracles of Jesus. I know there are periods in the Christian church, in the Christian life, where they become more or less controversial. People become more convinced they need to prove or disprove them. Strangely, for me, they've never been an issue, because I think that if you believe that God could make the universe and all things in it, then these miracles are really small fry compared to the great miracle, which is that we're alive, that God made us. So I tend to approach them in a literal sense, to read them and just see, how do they sound? What are they saying to us? In this one, it's the very well-known feeding of the 5,000. And it comes after a really difficult period for Jesus. In fact, just after he'd lost his relative and dear friend, John the Baptist, who'd been beheaded in the most brutal fashion. Well, you can't be beheaded in any other way, can you? But beheaded, and he must have felt absolutely bereft. I imagine he was just feeling grief. But of course, what we get from the reading is a sense of the momentum. Things are picking up pace. And he can't really stop. He carries that grief within him. We're told at the beginning of the reading that when he hears the terrible news, he goes away in a boat to a lonely place to be on his own. And it's one of those beautiful, tiny little details that has the ring of truth. It doesn't read, does it, like a manifesto or some kind of weird and great fantasy. This is believable, and it's one of the reasons why I believe when I read it. Jesus is feeling pretty awful, and he goes away. But of course, as I said earlier, the crowds won't let him go, and there are reasons for that. I mean, on the one hand, yes, there's this momentum that's beginning. He's becoming very, very famous in the area that he's in. The momentum that kind of draws him eventually towards the cross. And what happens is that when the crowds hear where he is, they all follow him, which is the other reason why this is happening, because the crowds are desperate for some kind of hope. We need to remember that they had been living under Roman occupation for centuries. Life was very, very difficult. There was no health care, there was no welfare state. And so people were desperate for something that would give them hope. And they were looking, for the return of God. They wanted him to come back and sort everything out. So Jesus, who'd been off on his own, presumably just quietly sitting and reflecting and maybe thinking about the friend he'd lost, is suddenly confronted with what we're called a great throng. people flock towards him. And it would have been, wouldn't it, so easy for him to be kind of cross or saying, I just can't be bothered with this. I need to be off on my own. But no, his initial response is compassion. And his initial action, despite his own sadness and grief, is to heal the sick. That's the first thing. He doesn't preach a sermon. He doesn't tell people off. He simply does the thing that is needed. He heals their sick. And they must have been so relieved, so absolutely and extraordinarily relieved when they realised that here was someone special. I don't think they realised really who he was. They just knew that something was happening. In the evening, of course, Jesus settles down with his disciples. He presumably takes a break, has a meal, and they come in and speak to him. They say to him something quite interesting, and again, it really does have the ring of truth. They say, come on, Jesus, it's a lonely, desolate old place. Send them off, get rid of them. They're now a nuisance. And again, we get this insight. And this is why I find this reading so interesting, because I've always been interested in the nature of God. What is God like? Because to me, that's a really important question that sustains my faith. And Jesus says, don't send them away. Something much more important, we've got to give them something to eat. And I think this points towards the extraordinary hospitality of God. Also, the ministry of hospitality. Almost a sacred ministry, isn't it? There's a major problem, though, because they don't have any food. Now, if anyone's been in that situation where you've got someone coming over, we're in this constantly at home. We open the fridge, we've got nothing in. It's embarrassing. This would have been mightily embarrassing, I suppose, because there were thousands of people. And what Jesus does is something I think it's quite funny. We see in the other Gospels slightly different versions. And essentially what he does is he takes a young boy's packed lunch and multiplies it into the most extraordinary feast for people. And this is, I think, the crux of it. In the Old Testament, when the Jewish people are hungry, God showers from heaven manna, this extraordinary bread. He showers it upon them, but he doesn't, as it were, get his hands dirty with them. It's charity done at a distance, but this isn't. This is empathy, and it's done hands-on. The food, of course, is extraordinary. They got extraordinarily satisfied by the food because it's lovely. Jesus does another thing here, and this is the last thing I want to say, because in that society, women and children weren't just second-class citizens. They just didn't count. In Roman society, women and children had no rights whatsoever. Children we could just get rid of them. And it was a very patriarchal society generally. Jewish society was as well. But Jesus feeds the women and the children. That would have been the most radical thing. He didn't just feed the men. He fed them all. And so what I take from this really amazing reading is that God has got compassion for us. Now that's important, because who would want to believe in a God that didn't have? There is a sense that a thread that runs throughout this miracle of the kind of common humanity of God, the hospitality of God. The people who came were hungry. They were hungry for healing. But in the end, they were hungry for food. And so Jesus, who is 100% God and 100% man, does what they need. I think it says to me something that's very heartening and convinces me that I am right to thrust ahead on my faith and do as similar as whatever I can do in terms of the hospitality ministry. But mainly, it reassures me about what God is like. Not the God who kind of throws food from heaven. Here, have some food. But the God who risks so much, risks that it might go wrong, hands out the food. And the promise is that one day, we will meet him and he will minister to us in the way that he ministered to these people. I find that extraordinarily encouraging. Amen.